And Abraham journeyed, going on still towards the south. That's interesting, because to go south means to go downhill. It's not good to go south. It's colloquial for going to where you shouldn't go. And so this is what happens to Abraham. His ascent is preceded by a descent. And that's very common in life, I would say. And so the redemptive element of this narrative is that if the covenant is constructed properly, so it's an ark, which is your decision to align yourself with God for all intents and purposes, then even the journey south can be part of a broader journey upward. And there was a famine in the land. That's Mother Nature failing to cooperate. I mean, that's got to be pretty disheartening for Abraham, don't you think? Because he finally gets it together when he's 75 to leave. And then, because God says, well, get going. And so the first place he goes, everyone's starving to death. It's like, you might think about that as a test of faith, wouldn't you say? But he keeps going. And then what happens? Well, he has to go to Egypt. So great. He goes where he's starving, where everyone's starving. And then to get away from where everyone's starving, he goes to a tyranny. So the whole beginning of the story is not particularly auspicious. And Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. It's a repetition of the same idea again. There's downhill voyage out into chaos, right? It's repeated over and over that the beginning of Abraham's journey is basically a sequence of experiences of exile, chaos, tyranny, and catastrophe. Well, you should be able to relate to that. You know how hard it is to get things together. You go out to do what you're supposed to do, say, and you're beset by the intransigence of the world and failure. Well, so what are you supposed to do about that? Well, maintain your faith in the good and continue to move forward. That's the idea. And part of that, even if you don't buy the metaphor, it's like, what are you going to do instead that won't make it worse? So even if it isn't an up that you're pursuing, you're at least forestalling the transformation of the chaos of your life into sheer hell. And that can certainly happen. You see people who are having a terrible time. And then you see people who are having a terrible time who are also in hell. And it's a lot better to just have a terrible time than to have a terrible time and be in hell at the same time. And it came to pass when he was come near to enter into Egypt that he said unto Sarai's wife, Behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. So look, Abraham is really having a rough time. He's a failure, right? He's wandering around through the land of starvation. Now he's going to go be a quasi-slave in Egypt. He has this incredibly attractive wife, and all he can look forward to is the fact that the most successful man in Egypt, the Pharaoh, will take her from him. So he's got the whole embitterment thing pretty much nailed down as far as I can tell. And this is when he makes one of his errors, let's say, and one of the errors that humanizes him. Say, I pray thee, that thou art my sister, that it may be well for me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. And it came to pass that when Abram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair. The princes also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he entreated Abram well for her sake. And he had sheep and oxen and he-asses and men servants and maid servants and she-asses and camels. So actually things work out pretty well for Abram, despite his deceit, right? Which is quite interesting. And I guess it's because if the overarching structure is solid, something like that, then errors can still be forgiven, to speak about it from a metaphorical perspective. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Well, it doesn't seem very fair, but because the Pharaoh didn't know, but it's not the right way to look at it. The right way to look at it, see, there's a story later in the Bible about David. And David could be a pretty bad guy, So one of the things he does is when he becomes king, he's in his castle. and he's looking over the city, and he sees a woman nude, sunbathing nude on a roof out on the city, and he's smitten by her, floored by her, and he has inquiries made about who she is. Her name is Bathsheba, and he finds out who her husband is, and her husband actually happens to be a general in his army, and he arranges for that general to be put at the thick of the battle and killed, and then he takes Bathsheba. So, and the Lord is not pleased by that, let's put it that way. And that's interesting, you know, it's an interesting story, because you might say, well, why can't the king do whatever the hell he wants? Like, seriously, he's the king. He's not just, and he's not like the prime minister or the president, right? He's the king. And so you might say, well, why is the king subject to any rules whatsoever? What's the rationale for the king being subject to rules? Well, the rationale emerges in these stories is there are social strictures that are such that even if the ruler of the land transgresses against them, there will be hell to pay. And that's continually presented over and over in the biblical stories. And it's a natural law sort of idea. It's that there are intrinsic rules to the game of social human being. And maybe intrinsic rules to the natural state of human being. You break those rules consciously or unconsciously at your absolute peril. And not only at your peril, but at the peril of the state. And it doesn't matter who you are. And so I would say this is actually an indication of God being fair rather than being unfair. Because the rule here is Pharaoh or not. You don't get to take someone else's wife, and ignorance is no excuse. Now you might say that's a little bit harsh, and perhaps it is a little bit harsh, but it's not without merit. The idea is not without merit. And of course Abram is complicit in this. Despite that, he is successful. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou now tell me that she was thy wife? Why saidst thou, she is my sister? I might have taken her to me to wife. Now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away and his wife and all that he had. And Abram went out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. And so it's interesting, you know, Abraham, he goes to the place of famine, and then he goes to the place of tyranny, and then he lies, and then he almost loses his wife. But because he goes, things work out for him. And so, hooray for that. And he went on his journeys from the south, even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar. So he makes another sacrifice, which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Well, so he's had an adventure, right? He's finished his journey. And so there's a culminating point in this narrative, and now he doesn't know what to do. He's left the place he's at. He doesn't know what to do. So it's time to build an altar and make a sacrifice and figure out, and to ask for divine guidance once again, to figure out, okay, well, I'm done that. Been there, done that. What's next? And the question is asked seriously, and this is something to consider. If you want to know what to do, ask seriously. And say, I'm willing to... See, Abraham sacrifices a life to his vow. Well, so what do? Well, you don't sacrifice an animal. You don't make a blood sacrifice. You do it psychologically. You say, I'm going to sacrifice my life to this aim. That's what you do if you're serious. What do I do next? Well, I'm going to sacrifice my life to this aim. What is it that I should do that's worth sacrificing my life to? That's a serious question. Well, and maybe that's the sort of question that people don't ask because they're afraid of the seriousness of the question and the magnitude of the potential answer. Do you really want to know what you should do that would be worth sacrificing your life to? Well, the answer is yes, because it's worth it. But the answer is also no, because, like, really, it's your life, you know? What if you're wrong? And you're probably wrong. But maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter, because maybe the rightness is in the process and not in and not in the decision, right? Because it's the beginning of a sequence of decisions, as we've already pointed out, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. And Lot also, which went with Abraham, had flocks and herds and tents, and the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle, the cowboys, and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. Well, and that's interesting too, because, Abram's having a pretty good time of it now, right? He's out of starvation. Hey, that's good. He's out of the tyranny. Now he's kind of wealthy. And then the story flips on him. He's wealthy, and now a bad thing happens to him, right? It's that he's got all this wealth, and so does his nephew, and now they can't get along because they have too much stuff. So that's quite comical as well. I think that's a comic interlude here. Now, they handle it properly. And Abram said unto Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, because we're brothers. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If you'll take the left, then I'll take the right. Or if you depart to the right, then I'll go to the left. So basically they sit down and say, well, one of us has got to get out of town, and it can be one or the other. It doesn't really matter. We can flip a coin, but we have to separate. And so they do it amicably. And Lot lifted up his eyes and looked at all of the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. So that's an intimation of Eden, right? Because you remember, Eden means well watered place. Before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. So interesting, you get foreshadowing here again, right? So Lot and Abram are making the decision about where to go, and Lot looks out and sees a reasonable place, but then this warning comes up that there's a city out there, there's a place out there where things are not going to go well. Things are being done badly, and things are not going to go well. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves, the one from the other. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked, and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Now the word sin, I've mentioned this to you before, I think. It's an interesting word. It's the derivation of an archery term, in my understanding of its derivation. The Greek word was hamartia, and hamartia is an archery term which means to miss the bullseye. And you think it's worth thinking about that metaphorically, because you got to think about all the ways that you could miss the bullseye, right? You could close your eyes. That's very common. You could just not lift up the damn bow and arrow to begin with. You could face the wrong way. You could be unskilled in your aim. But I also like the archery metaphor, because human beings are built on a hunting platform, right? And we always aim at things. We're ballistic creatures on a trajectory always. And we're always aiming at something. We're always aiming at the mark, which is, of course, what you do when you hunt, right? Because you have to hit the mark precisely. And that's what we're like. And so, but we're like that psychologically. We have to aim at something and then move towards it. And so to sin is to miss the mark, is to miss the bullseye, to fail to take aim, to aim badly, to aim carelessly, or to not aim at all. And that says, well, that's like a sin of omission. That's to not do. And then to be wicked is to aim at what you know you shouldn't aim at. And again, I don't think of that as an external morality precisely. I think that you can read the entire biblical narrative, again, from a psychological perspective, and say, we're not talking about external codes of conduct here, although we could. We're not. The wickedness that's being described is the act of you doing something that you know to be wrong, period. And you may do something you don't know if it's wrong or not. That isn't the sort of thing that we're talking about. And we're not talking about the things that you do that are right, or that other people think are wrong. We're not talking about those either. We're talking about those things that you consciously do, although you know them to be wrong yourself. And that's the things that seem to get people into the most trouble in these stories. And I believe that to be the case. I think that's very accurate psychologically. It's amazing because I see this all the time. If you do something wrong, and it's because you're ignorant, you don't know better, it doesn't go well for you. That's the case. But if you do something wrong and you know it's wrong, the punishment is manifold. And I think the reason for that is because that makes you Cain. It means you betray your own ideal, right? If you just don't know, well, you haven't betrayed your ideal. You're just not together. Maybe you're even willfully blind. But if you do something you know to be wrong, then you've betrayed your own ideal. And that lands you. Cain says to God, once Cain destroys Abel, he says, I cannot bear my punishment.